I'm sure you will have noticed when doing the readings for this particular topic that the high-fat diets for endurance athletes are fairly controversial. Some people strongly advocate for the use of high-fat diets to benefit performance of endurance athletes, whereas other people are a little bit more cautious and reluctant to recommend high-fat diets. And then there's also other people who strongly advocate for high carbohydrate diets for endurance athletes. And current recommendations around carbohydrates suggest that we don't need a blanket high carbohydrate approach, but we do need to periodize and individualize our carbohydrate recommendations for individual endurance athletes based on their training demands and also the goals and objectives of the current training phase. Now, despite this controversy around high-fat diets and endurance exercise, there's really isn't a lot of direct comparisons of high-fat diets compared with the more traditional high-carbohydrate diets, or certainly not the more contemporary periodized carbohydrate intake. So I've put this one study up here for you, which is a recent study that has compared these three dietary approaches over a short period of time of 3 weeks in a fairly specific athlete population, and that's elite race walkers. So this study is done out of the Institute of Sport here in Australia, and it compares these three diets over for elite race walkers, and it looks at their fat oxidation during exercise, it looks at their oxygen consumption during exercise, and it also looks at their race walking performance. And the study actually shows that the high carbohydrate diet and the periodized carbohydrate approach are certainly superior to the low carbohydrate high fat diet over this 3-week period. Now, I'd caution you to use this study as definitive evidence that high-fat diets are not effective for endurance athletes, because this is a small study and it's also over a specific 3-week period. So this short-term period might have been a very stark contrast for the athletes that were put on the high-fat diet to what they usually consume, and it may well have been this shock or change in their diet that resulted in a decrease in performance, or not an improvement in performance for this particular group. And certainly the advocates of high-fat diets would suggest that you need a longer period of time to get into this nutritional ketosis state in which you're really ramping up your capacity to use fat during exercise. So I think the jury is still out on whether or not high-fat diets are going to be effective for endurance athletes. This study certainly shows that if an endurance athlete is looking to change to a high-fat diet over a short period of time, such as 3 weeks, then that definitely should not be recommended. However, I don't think this study provides evidence to discount any recommendation to have a longer-term high-fat diet. We simply need more evidence before we can actually recommend that. My personal opinion is I suspect that high-fat diets may be suitable and also beneficial for selected individual athletes who tend to be best able to oxidize fat during exercise, whereas high-fat diets may not be that suitable for other athletes who are more likely to want to use carbohydrate during exercise. Unfortunately, the way we do studies in science is we tend to look for generalizations across the whole population. So if there are some individuals that benefit and some individuals that don't, we'll often find an overall net sort of non-benefit across the population. So I think we need to be thinking about this on a more individual basis rather than looking at group averages when we're doing some of the future studies in this area. But it's certainly an interesting area, and we need to do more research to really define and decide what might be best to recommend for endurance athletes when it comes to the amount of fat that they are consuming.